This is Tierney, and we're doing our Journalology workshop online, and we're just trying to get started and getting organized and learning how to do online things. So just a little bit of a quick background. I think most of you know me. I'm very interested in literary journals. That'll be pretty obvious. I've been published in over 50 literary journals. And one of the reasons I think literary journals are so interesting is that I really believe that my journal publications helped me get my poetry book accepted. And then I used my poetry book to pimp my novel, which also got accepted. So I think the journals are a good way to get started. And let me just move on to the slides here. This is just a brief overview of the why we think literary journals are important. Literary journals are the proto-stars of the literary universe, meaning that's where things form, that's where things gel, that's where literary ideas often start. Famous authors often appear first in journals, and then you'll also see that a lot of famous authors will appear in a literary journal to try out new work or to try out something very experimental. Many journals are open to new authors and experimental work that might not have a chance with traditional publications. We're talking about, of course, about fiction, nonfiction, and poetry. There's literally thousands of journals looking for contributors. By publishing in journals, you can kick off your literary career, build up some credits, and experience the thrill of publication. So what should you do first before you even think about getting published in a literary journal? The most important thing, as always, is craft. Keep trying to improve your work, revise and restart, go to workshops, get better as you go along. Understand the competition. We need to realize that there's really many outstanding poets, fiction and nonfiction writers out there. MFA programs are turning out new writers every year, so there's always a lot of competition. Prepare for rejection. I think it's important to realize that when you send out to literary journals, they're going to be selecting the best work that they get. They a lot of times reject work that's very outstanding. I think that it's really healthy to set a rejection goal for the year rather than an acceptance goal. A rejection goal means that you're out there trying, you're sending your work out. Last year, I had about 200 rejections. Wow. So I met my goal for last year. Keep writing, keep sending out work, and remember that it only takes one editor to love your submission. My experience has been that sometimes I've sent something out and it's been accepted right away. Sometimes I've sent something out to maybe 20 different journals and finally gotten an acceptance. And then that editor will say they just love it. So persistence is one of the keys. Why should we try submitting to literary journals? Finding anonymous readers for your work, I think, is very important. These are readers that are not your family and friends. They're not people that are going to always say that what you write is wonderful. These are the people that you want to reach if you want to have a literary career. Improving your self-confidence as a writer. I think it's really important to take a step from your office or your work shed or wherever it is that you're writing and take the chance of sending your work out. By sending your work out, you also join the literary conversation. Your work will be out in the world along with all the great writers of the past and present. I like to think of the literary tradition, people have heard me say this before, as kind of a stream of voices, and you add your voice to the stream. Building up publication credits, I mentioned, but it's also a way of showing that other editors like your work. So when you send out to another journal or you want to get your book published, you already have shown that there's some editors who have selected your work for publication. Any journal publication adds to your readership. A lot of journals are online. They have readership of maybe 100 or more. Some journals are up to thousands. But anytime you get a publication, somebody's going to be looking at your work. Who do literary journals publish? As I mentioned before, new and famous authors both can be published in journals. Most journals take pride in finding new authors. You'll often see them if you look on the first page of a journal. We'll look at a couple of journals. You might see that they'll mention some of the authors that were originally published in their journal. That's one of their prides that they take. Some journals tend to publish more requested or agented material. What I mean by agented material is, say, stories that are actually brought to a journal by an agent. So some of them publish more of that type of work than others. Top tier journals like the New Yorker, the Sun, Plowshares, Granta, and others seldom accept unsolicited manuscripts. So it's still worth maybe submitting to them sometimes if you feel like you have very strong work, but you need to understand the chances. Some journals also get more submissions than others. Popular journals often receive thousands of manuscripts a year. I talked to one editor recently who said that he gets, and this is not a very well-known journal, but he gets around 3,000 manuscripts a year for stories, and he can publish 40. Some are more open to newer writers, and this is something we'll talk about a little bit more, but some lesser-known journals and newer journals are often more approachable for writers who are trying to kick off their careers. Some journals have unique demographics. What I mean by that is that they might be focused on a geographical region. They might be LGBT journals. These are things that if you meet that demographic, you have a better chance of getting published in those journals. So how do you get started? The best thing to do is to start making a list of journals that you think might be interested in your work. Where do you find the journals? Bookstores often have a list or a shelf of journals. You can find journals in libraries, and you can also find journals online. Most journals these days do have online versions. There's also sources you can go to find lists of journals. There's submission tools that we'll talk about more, such as Duotrope and Submittable. There's also writing resources that you can go to for lists of journals, such as Poets and Writers, Writer's Digest, Poetry Flash, our local journal is an excellent source for calls for submissions and references to other journals. One thing I like to do is I look in books. If you pick up a poetry book or a book of short stories in particular, you might see an acknowledgments page where they'll say where they got published before. So that's a good place to add to your list. You can also, in journals themselves, journals will publish contributor notes for the poets or the writers who are included in their journal. And within those notes, they might say that they've been published before in X journal or Y journal, and you can add those to your list. The next step you want to take is to analyze a journal to see if it's really right for you. The most important thing is of course reading the journal, and I don't mean you necessarily need to read every journal, from front to back, but you can scan the journals, especially online, and see if there's work there that attracts you, or work that seems to have some familiarity or similarity to the work that you're doing. Study the About page. Usually the journals will have a About page, and that will state kind of the mission of the journal and the type of work that they're looking for. This might also include what literary genre the journal publishes. Is it fiction, nonfiction, novel excerpts, poetry reviews? You can get that from looking at the table of contents or scanning the journal, but they might also just tell you what they look for. Another thing that I think is important is the tone of the work. For example, do they publish a lot of experimental work? Do they publish LGBT work? Is it speculative fiction, lyrical poetry, etc.? And you can see that by scanning the work and seeing what other things are published there. I also like to look at the editorial staff. A lot of times the editorial staff themselves will say a few words about themselves and the type of work that they published. Often the editorial staff for a literary journal are writers themselves. So it's very interesting to see what kind of taste they might have, what kind of background. And also you can use Google to find out what they write. And that's sometimes very interesting. You need to be careful though, because a lot of times editors are very open-minded and they'll publish a lot of work that might not be the kind of work that they would write, but sometimes you get an idea of what their taste is. Another thing I look at is longevity. How long has a journal been published? I think that's interesting because newer journals a lot of times are much more open to newer writers, and also journals that have been around for a while, might be more stable. So you can count on them having their web page up for a longer period of time. So there's some trade-offs in longevity. I mentioned before about reviewing the journal contributors, and I think this is a good way to understand the journal. The experience and background of authors, if you're an emerging author, like many of us are, you want to find journals that are going to be open to publishing emerging authors. So when you look at the contributor notes, one of the things I like to look for is, do all the contributors have books? Are they all MFA grads? Where have they been published? And I mentioned before, when you find out where they've been published, you can add that to your list. Are there some newer authors? In other words, how can you tell a newer author? Well, you can tell because maybe they don't have a book. Maybe they haven't had very many previous publications, or maybe it's their first publication. And that's a good sign for you because that means that the editor is open to emerging authors. Sometimes you can see that the authors share a common demographic. And again, it's trying to match yourself to the demographic. And then you might want to separate the contributors by their genre. One thing is very interesting is that some journals will be much more open to, say, poetry than fiction, or they might have a higher acceptance rate for poetry than fiction often, or they might have a certain demographic that they're looking for in fiction, but not necessarily in poetry. So it's another way of just kind of analyzing the journal to see if your work is going to fit. Now we start getting into the submission details. Each journal has submission requirements that they're looking for, and then there's also things that you can look for in terms of helping you understand whether or not you want to submit to the journal. Some journals pay for publication, but most literary journals don't pay, or they pay very little. I think that just the fact that you get published in a literary journal is payment enough, but if you're an established author, you might be looking more for journals that pay. Simultaneous submissions, there's still some journals that don't allow simultaneous submissions. What that means is that a journal will want exclusively to look at your work for a certain period of time before you submit to any other journals. I tend to not submit to those anymore because I think that journals need to realize that writers have to beat the odds somehow. And one of the ways we beat the odds is by simultaneous submissions. Submission fees, some journals charge minimal fees to cover online tools in particular. It might be like $3 or $5. I typically think it's worth it to pay those fees. And the reason I feel that way is that journals usually don't make any money anyway. And we want to kind of keep the literary universe breathing, and you keep the literary universe breathing by throwing them a few bucks now and then. Editorial feedback is very rare. You very seldom get editorial feedback from a journal. Um, Sometimes journals will offer a special fee to get some feedback. I have found, even if it's like 2 or 3 sentences, that it's extremely valuable and it's worth it. Because again, it's an anonymous reader who's giving you feedback on your work. And they might say something about the structure of a story, or they might say something they like about the story, or something that doesn't work for them. And this is all stuff that's very valuable that you can use to improve your own work. You want to see whether or not they take email, submission mail manager. We'll talk about some of these tools in a minute, or snail mail. There's still a few journals out there that only do postal mail. I stopped submitting to them. It's just too much work. I used to, in the old days, it used to be that that's all they had, but making copies and putting it in a letter is difficult. The only exception is maybe journals that you really like. For example, I really like Ziziva, so I've submitted to them a couple of times, even though it's only a mail submission. Another thing you need to pay attention to that's not always really obvious, but you want to have it in the back of your mind, is whether or not their submission window is open. A lot of journals are only open for a certain month or two a year, or it could be longer, and some of them are open all the time. Obviously, you don't want to send your submission to a journal that isn't reading. And then the manuscript requirements are extremely important, and we'll talk about those in a little bit more detail. Something else that I think is very important, and we'll talk about this even more as we get into some of the submission tools that writers can use, are submission statistics. And this is a way of trying to see if you have a better or worse chance with certain journals. So the things I look at the number of submittals that a journal is getting, the number of pieces they publish. This is important because, say, an annual journal might only publish 4 or 6 stories a year, but then there's some journals that publish several stories a week. Obviously, the ones that are publishing more often are ones that you have a better chance of getting published in. Acceptance rates, and again, you need a tool to be able to see this, but some of the top journals have acceptance rates of much less than 1%. But it's something you need to know when you're submitting the work. Rates for submittals and acceptances often vary by genre. What I mean by that is that you might find a journal that is accepting, say, 10% of the stories that are submitted, but only 2% of the poems. So depending on which genre you're submitting, you might add them to your list or move them up or down in your list. Personalized responses. Some journals, as with editorial feedback, do give some personalized responses, and they are useful. For example, it might just be like a one-liner. If you send them 3 poems, they might identify the one poem that they like the best. And this is information, again, that you can use in improving your work or improving your submission to the next journal. Another thing that I look at is whether or not they've accepted anything recently. And this is important because a lot of times journals will accept a lot of work, but then they filled up their next several issues, and then they stop accepting things. And so that's important for you to know whether or not you're going to have better chance as you're submitting to them. I'm going to pause a second here. So I spent a year as a manuscript reader for Prairie Schooner, which is one of the top journals, and I some of the things I'm saying I've already mentioned, but we received approximately 100 submittals per week or more. I just read poetry. I was a poetry reader. So out of the poetry I would read every week, I would get about 50 of them were just not, they weren't formatted. They were handwritten, some of them. They were typed on onion skin paper. They sounded like, Hallmark cards. So there was usually about 50% that I could just, um, reject right away. Then there was usually about, say 20 to 30% that were very competent, were actually very, very well written. Out of those, I was told to pick something somewhere around five per week. That was kind of my ration as a reader. I would give five to the editor. Out of those five per week, that's like 250. The journal was publishing quarterly. They were doing about, maybe about 100 poems per year at the most. So you figure there's 1 or 2% of the poems we were receiving at that time that would actually end up being published. But I'm just leading into how important it is to look professional and to start off well with your manuscript. That helps you a lot, and also that you can have very strong work, and you might not hit a particular editor, but you might hit the next editor. So a typical journal, I wanted to show you what a journal looks like online. Fictive Dream I picked because it's also a good journal for emerging authors to target. So I'll have a couple of other journals that you can take a look at. But Fictive Dream, one of the reasons I like them is because they're one of the journals that does uh, publish more often. They publish several stories a week, and so there's a little bit more chance there. And they have a pretty active online community. So this is kind of what it looks like. These are all the most recent stories. And we'll take a quick look at the about page. So this is the about page for Fictive Dream. So one of the interesting things is that, they tell a little bit about their philosophy. They have a philosophy drawn from John Gardner, who actually has a book on writing that's very good. But what's interesting about them is, so they're saying that they like fiction with a contemporary feel that gives an insight to the human condition. So I would say probably, if you're writing experimental work, it might not be the best thing for you. It certainly wouldn't be a good best journal for you if you're writing poetry, because they only do stories. But they like distinctive voice, clarity of thought, precision of language. They'll take any subject. So if this is the kind of work that you're doing, then this would fit you. And as a lot of journals do, is they like you to take a look at their stories. You read a couple of their stories, skim their stories, and see whether or not you feel like you'll fit. Their submit page has their submission guidelines, and we'll go into the submission guidelines in a little bit more detail. But one of the things that's very common is they'll say what word counts that they publish. They don't go any farther than 2,500 words. So if you have a story that's 4,000 words, there's no sense in sending it. They like to get their work in an email. They don't take PDFs. They only take Word doc files. They want a brief biography of 75 words or less. That's pretty typical. Note that the biography, they always want the biography to be in the third person. The reason for that is so that they can turn around and put it right onto their page, and they don't have to rewrite it. Presenting in a simple typeface. I'll talk about that a little bit more, but a common typeface is Times New Roman.
No, Terry, don't mind us.
Okay. And they do accept simultaneous submissions. And this is also kind of typical. They'll ask you to send only one story at a time, so they don't get their submission queue really clogged up. They don't pay, but and there's usually a proviso talking about initial editorial, or I'm sorry, first serial rights, and that's pretty typical of journals. And this one says that they want to be able to keep posting your story, which is actually a pretty good thing, but the copyright reverts to you if you want to publish it anywhere else. Okay, so we talked about having the our target list. So our target list has grown as we've looked at journals, added things to our list. Okay.
Don't mind us.
All right. Sorry, there's some elves in the background here, working on things. So eliminate journals that don't match your genre, style, or demographic. Why bother sending to them? Eliminate journals that are not reading submissions at the present time. If you like the journal, hold it for when their submission window opens. Move journals with unusual submission criteria to the bottom of your list. I'll talk about this a little bit more, but if you run into a journal that, for example, there's a journal that I was interested in, and they wanted, not center justified. What is it called when they have the fill? There's there's kind of both sides. But anyway, what the bottom line is, I would have had to go through and reformat my story, or change the page numbering, or something, and or take out all of the tabs. If you run into journals that want special requirements, I put them to the bottom of my list. If I feel like I have time to do it, I will do it. So I call it an unmathematical formula, and I'll try to explain it. I'm not a mathematician. I'm just a writer, but submission attractiveness, S equals NAR. So submission attractiveness is the number of pieces they publish per year times their acceptance rate is a fraction. So maybe it's 1 in 100 times their response time. So let me kind of explain what this means. Is that I think if they publish a lot of pieces per year, that increases your chances of being published. If they have a submission rate that's, say, better than 1%, or somewhere in there, that helps. But if they publish a lot of work and they have a low submission rate, you still have a reasonably good chance of being one of those. But if they don't publish many a year and they have a low acceptance rate, then that definitely goes against you. And then I think response time is also a factor. There's some journals that will turn around a submission within a week, and then there's some that take like 6 months to a year. So my feeling is that the response times also help your hit rate, because if the editors are turning around your submissions quicker, that gives you a better chance of finding a market for your work. So obviously, if journals that have very low acceptance rates, don't publish many submissions per year, and take a year to answer, I generally don't bother. I don't waste my time. Okay, so what about themes and contests? So many journals will provide a theme or a subject for a submission period. And I think that sometimes that can be very interesting. It can be a lot of fun. Some that I've seen recently are taste, more than one, tribulations, Halloween. I think if the theme inspires you, if you like that theme, go for it. But I think you should also consider the other side a little bit. Um, Typical acceptance rates in other markets for your theme creation. Is the effort worthwhile? In other words, if you write a story, if you spend a bunch of time writing a story about Halloween and you submit it to this contest and you don't win, are you going to be able to use that story anywhere else? That to me is important. Um, the other thing is that, on the other hand, you might already have a Halloween story, and so it'd be great. Go ahead and set that Halloween story to the Halloween contest. Um, and one of the things I'll show you is there are places where you can get lists of contests or calls for submission. You can scan those, and if you just happen to have a story in your drawer that meets one of those, go ahead and submit it. But but again, unless you're really inspired, you're writing for a specific contest is maybe not the best use of your time. Contests are a great way to gain recognition, and many of them offer cash prizes. I've seen some for like $1,000, $2,000. That's great. However, a lot of them require submission fees. A lot of contests will require $10 or $20 submission fees, and they also get extremely large number of entries. And this is actually true because I subscribe to Rattle, the poetry magazine. They had a chapbook contest, and they had 3,000 entries, and they had 2 chapbooks. They only guaranteed one, but they decided to do 2. Well, if you can figure out the percentage of that, that's something like 0.006% chance of acceptance. So if you feel very strongly about your work and you want to submit, certainly do it. But you need to understand the chances there too for some of these contests. The best thing, I think, is if you're interested in a contest, look for contests that will also publish your work. In other words, there might be a contest that's looking for the best story of the year, but they also say that they're going to publish the best stories. Even if you don't win the contest, there's a good chance that your story might be published. So I would look for those. Okay, typical submission preparation. Submitting manuscripts the way the journal wants them is very important. You don't want to be kind of left out just because you're not submitting correctly. Formatting and style. The style books that I recommend are the MLA Handbook, and some of these have been around for a long time. So if you have an old copy that you kept from college, or know somebody that's going to college that has one, it's fine. The Chicago Manual of Style is kind of the standard. Something that's really good for usage and in questions like, do I put a comma at the end of this phrase or not, is Strunk and White. So the Strunk and White is a very useful manual to have on your shelf. A good font to use for manuscripts is Times New Roman, 12 point. The reason I say that is because I've never seen a journal that will not allow Times New Roman 12 point. And so a lot of times they'll specify certain fonts they won't take or fonts they will take, and Times New Roman is always on the list. What you don't want to do is you don't want to have weird fonts, underlines, highlights, stuff like that in your manuscript. Let your words stand for themselves. Let your work stand for yourself. If you're putting a lot of highlights in your manuscript, it's kind of a flag to a reader. 1-inch margins justify left. That's pretty obvious. No cover page. Typically, journals don't want to see a cover page. Again, this is pretty much MLA format style, but includes your name and contact info on the first page, unless the submission is blind. If the submission is blind, what that means is they don't want your name anywhere on the manuscript because they read all the submissions blind, pick the best ones, and then match them back up to the authors. I typically put my name and contact information on the upper left, so it's right on right there on the first page. I mentioned earlier save submission as doc or docx. That seems to be what most people want. And then a brief cover letter. Typically, a cover letter should be, much less than say one type page. It's always nice to address the editor by name if you know them. So if you go to the About page when you're looking at the journal, you can typically find out what the editor's name is, or the fiction editor, or the poetry editor if you're writing to those specific genres. Identify the piece you're submitting. So you might say something like, please consider my story, how the potato crossed the road, whatever, and if it's a story. So wrapping up the submission process stuff, I wanted to add a few tips here also. As I mentioned before, prepare yourself for rejection. All authors get rejected, even famous authors. So set a rejection goal for the year. My rejection goal was 200 last year, as I mentioned, and I made my goal. Don't bother sending out work that needs editing. I sometimes hear people say that, they'll send something out and they'll get some nice feedback and make it better and all that. Don't bother, because with the amount of competition out there, if you send out work that needs editing, you're just kind of setting yourself up for disappointment. Submit your manuscript to 5 or more journals at once. That's kind of the thumbnail that I use, assuming they allow simultaneous submissions. This increases your chances, obviously. If you have a manuscript that gets a dozen or more rejections, and I've certainly had those, that's maybe a good chance to do a revision. And sometimes the revision doesn't have to be really major. I, for example, changed the title of a poem and had it accepted right away. Rinse and repeat. Keep your manuscripts in play. I think a good rule is every time you get something rejected, send it back out immediately. Don't think about it. Keep writing. Keep working on improving your craft, and keep trying to make each thing you write better than the last. Okay, so we'll start talking about tools, as I mentioned, for writers to use for analysis and tracking. You can use your personal memory if it's better than mine. I can never remember where I've sent things. And I want to mention too that this sounds like a good problem to have, but it was really very embarrassing. I once had a poem accepted by 2 journals because I forgot that I'd sent one of them. But it's still embarrassing. You can use notebooks, Rolodexes, email folders, spreadsheet. I used a spreadsheet for years. Sometimes I still do, but it's very labor intensive. And there's now some online tools I think that are very, very useful that I'll cover a little bit. All of them have search capability. They have descriptions of journals, which help you select them. They include calls for submissions, including contests. So you can select which ones of those you're interested in. A lot of them, most of them provide live links to journals, and they provide a method for you to track your submissions. So a few of them to start with. The Submission Grinder is a free open source tool that anyone can use. I have the link on the slide here. The search criteria I find is somewhat limited. You'll end up with a lot of hits on pretty much every search you do. Some of the journal entries I found to be out of date. Since it's a open source tool, it's not updated as frequently as it could be. It does provide a decent tracking tool. Submittable, you'll see that a lot of journals use Submittable to track their submissions. And I mentioned earlier that that's sometimes one of the reasons that journals will ask for a small submission fee, because Submittable, they have to pay to use it. But it's free to writers, it's free. It's used by the publishers. The search criteria within Submittable is limited. However, I really like they do have a really nice call for submission page that you can scan and find contests and journals that are actually looking for submissions. It's not very useful for tracking unless the journal uses it, then it's automatic. So if all these submissions you make are to journals using Submittable, it's a very useful tracking tool, but you can't add things that you submitted by other means. Poets and Writers is a very good resource. You can subscribe to Poets and Writers. They provide a monthly journal and also access to their website. The search criteria is limited, but they have very nice journal summaries of the individual journals as you search. It's another good source for contests, calls for submissions. In fact, a lot of the journals will publish their calls for submissions and contests in Poets and Writers first, and their tracking tool is okay. There's other tools out there. These are the ones that I'm familiar with, that I've used, that I still use. So moving on. So my preferred tool, the one I use the most, is called Duotrope. There's a free version that has limited features, and there's a full version that costs $50 a year. My opinion is that it's a good investment. Each journal has a journal page with a summary, submission history for the journal, not just your submissions, and links to the journal homepage. It has excellent search criteria that includes things like acceptance rates, response times. You can separate by genre. The actual tool itself is updated every few minutes. It has some very useful standard reports, things like the fastest journals to respond, the least responsive, most approachable, meaning they have the best acceptance rates, etc. They have very useful news updates. This is something that I use quite a bit. I mentioned new journals are sometimes journals that might be more open to emerging writers. They also publish journals that are open and closed for submissions at a given time. And they also publish lists of recent acceptances. So these are writers who subscribe to Duotrope, like you might, who have recently had acceptances in certain journals. It almost sounds like cheating, but if I see that a journal has accepted a few people recently, I might submit something to that journal, because it means that they're reading and they're filling up an issue, probably. And so it's a good chance to maybe hit their desk. There's an ability to create and save searches, which I find useful. I'll show you a couple of those. It's a good tracking tool. And it's also very useful for tracking agents and book manuscripts. Those are kind of special topics that aren't really covered in this presentation. Maybe we can do that at a different time, but you can track those within this tool. This is the actual Duotrope homepage. So you see that you can go to publishing news, market responses. You can do searches from here. Just to make it quicker, I have saved a couple of pages. So this is a list of recent responses that you can click out of from the previous thing. So I mentioned you can scan through this. This shows you journals' responses recently. So you can see here the Literary Stories and the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction has actually accepted something. You can also see that there's an awful lot of journals that haven't accepted anything recently. But this gives you an idea of the action out there in the marketplace. Well, let me go back here. I want to show one other thing. So within this this list, you can also separate fiction and poetry. You can also sort out things that are on your own pending submissions list. And I'll get to that. I'll get to that in a minute. Something that I like to look at. This is a list of new journals and that are recently added to the market. So these are all new journals that have just come up in the last week. So these are brand new literary journals that you could submit to, that obviously don't have a backlog. Temp closed, when you see temp closed here, it means just that their submission window is not open right now. There's a list here of, these are markets that have recently opened to submissions, ones that are closed. So you don't want to send to closed ones, obviously. And then ones with status changes. And this is very interesting because some journals do close, or they decide that they don't want to read any more manuscripts for a while. Another useful feature is you can read interviews with editors. So the editors will say the type of manuscripts that they're looking for and so forth, which can be very, very useful. So I wanted to show you this is the duotrope front page for Fictive Dream that we just looked at a minute ago. So it tells what the type of work they submit, they accept. Then it also gives the recent submission statistics for the journal. So they've received 95 reports recently. They've accepted about 7% of them. And another thing that I find very useful is they have a list of people from that submit to Duotrope or use Duotrope as a tool that submitted to Fictive Dream, also submitted to these other journals, and ones that were accepted by Fictive Dream also had their work accepted by these other journals. So there's two lists there. I find this very useful because it's another way to add to my possible submission list of journals I can hit. These might, there's thousands of journals, so this is another way to add something to your list. There's a page, this is another page that you can get to from the front page of standard reports that Duotrope publishes. I mentioned, the fastest, slowest. Well, it's useful because, as I said, if you want to get, journals that have, fairly quick response time. So for example, I might submit to a journal that's very tough to get into if it has a fast response time, because I'm not really losing very much. But I don't really want to have my work sitting out there for a year. I'll go back to some of these other, these are some saved searches that I've done, that I've saved for myself, that I've, to create possible places for me to send my work. And then this is just their search page and all the different things you can search for. So I wanted to go back a second here. I've been mentioning so let's take a look at the slowest, fastest, most challenging. So these are the slowest journals that for fiction, Ziziva, unfortunately, but these are ones that are the slowest. These are the most challenging, but notice how low these acceptance rates are, but there's also some that have not recorded any acceptances at all in the past year within Duotrope. There's a lot of writers that use Duotrope, probably not all writers, of course, but these are journals that I've mentioned that, at least according to Duotrope, have zero acceptance rate.
Zero.
So things like New Yorker, Boulevard, Georgia Review, these are great journals. But
it's not that they don't publish anything, it's just that the percentages is so low, it's effectively zero.
well, it means that of the members of Duotrope, of the people that are using the Duotrope tool, none of them have gotten an acceptance in the last year.
So which are the fastest?
The fastest
Are those, yeah.
are these. Unoya Review, Typishly. So some of these have responses, 1 or 2 days, which is nice. And then there's a number of them here that the approachable ones are the ones that have the, this is a little bit off the page here. I don't think I can move it either. Some of these have very high acceptance rates. This is about the ones with the highest are down to about 17% or something like that. But still, my feeling is that once something is out there, it's a link that you can use in your own web page and so forth, and people are going to be reading it. So, but this gives you an idea of journals that might be more open to your work, and especially if you're an emerging writer, getting some acceptances out there is very useful. Okay, so then also I wanted to show you just quick. That's the search. Let's see. Okay, then this is the control panel for the tool. This is customized to you, so you can see that I sent out myself 246 pieces last year.
Wow. So that's how you got 200 rejection and you got 46 published.
Well, no, some of them are still active. So,
Okay.
but yeah, so my acceptance rate is around 4%.
Why does it say, oh, I see. But that's actually pretty good. It's higher than the average.
Yeah, which is amazing. So, oops.
Huh.
Okay, so this is the submission tracker I really like, and I apologize. I'm not sure why my screen size is so weird, but this will show you these are all the submissions that I currently have active right now. You see, there's quite a few of them.
That's impressive. And is it different?
And it also shows.
Is each of those a unique submission or a
Yes. Each of them is a unique submission. Well, some of them, like these poems, I sent as a group.
I see.
But I track them. I track them separately.
Fall of a Union Man, is that
That's a story, and I decided to send it to a lot of people at once.
So that's simultaneous.
Yeah, this is simultaneous, and so I'm trying something different. I'm trying sending it to a lot more. This is what some people call carpet bombing.
Well, and some people just call simultaneous submissions.
Yeah, typically I only send to like 3 or 5, but I decided to try sending to a bunch more. So I sent to a bunch that are very, very difficult to get into, and then I sent to some that are not so difficult to get into. I think a public space was on the list of 0. A couple of these were on the list of 0, but I figured, what the heck, I'll give it a try. So anyway, and then there's also a page which, let's see if I can get to it. This is also very useful. This is a list of all the pieces that I've put into Duotrope. So you have a list of all your pieces. It tells you, is it fiction or poetry, and then also the submission history. So you can see I have some here that I've been out, 26 times,
Nice.
but it got published.
Congratulations.
So, this star means, but some have not been. So I have, several pieces that have never been published, probably never will be, but they're on the list. Okay, so that's really about the extent of duo. I did some searches, and these are journals that I'm familiar with that might be really good ones for emerging authors. So there's a lot more. I mentioned you can go into, if you go into something like Duotrope, you can see the journals that are, more, amenable to, have the, higher acceptance rates. And these are a few that I've actually looked at that, look like pretty good journals and are ones that are, that I would recommend for emerging authors. So, and also don't forget, Fictive Dream was one of the journals that I mentioned earlier. So these are, and I mentioned here that there's many more, but Adelaide Literary Magazine, Scarlet Leaf Review, Potato Soup Journal is relatively new, Spelk, Fiction on the Web, and then there's some poetry magazines, Page and Spine, the Magnolia Review. It's interesting, Magnolia Review is one of those journals that it has a much lower acceptance rate for fiction than poetry. So it's a good journal to hit with poetry. Plumtree Tavern, New Verse News, Coffin Bell. I just read those out in case people are having trouble seeing the slide. But again, these are some places to start, but there's certainly more that you can get to by looking at Duotrope and doing some of your own research. Okay, so just conclusion. This is a conclusion slide. Read literary journals. I think that's important. Subscribe to literary journals. Keep them going. A lot of times the subscriptions are free and you can get them in your inbox. Make tip jar donations if you can. A lot of times they'll ask for, if you do submissions, they'll ask for $2 or $3. You'll never miss it, but it really helps the literary universe. Buy books. I think it's important to buy books. I think it's important to go to readings, hear what other, in addition to reading journals and reading books, hear what other authors are writing. Submit to journals. I think it's important to go ahead and submit and join the conversation. And there are journals out there looking for work. There's journals that will take your work. And overall, my feeling is you want to add your mojo to the literary universe. Be part of it.
Right.
So that's the end of my slides. So we certainly have a few minutes for any questions or discussion.
Well, we also need to be out of here in 15 minutes, so I think
Okay.
what we do is
So we have maybe 1 minute.
one
no, just
minute.
kidding.
What's 1 minute? One question. Anybody have a question for Terry?
Question for Terry. How do you determine if a journal is not worth your time? Because I know there's kind of like a balance between emerging artists and just kind of like somebody who has a blog that no one reads. And a lot of places I know only want to take, especially for poetry, something the first time it's printed. So I feel like even though I'm happy to get my work out there anywhere, I'm worried about, the preciousness of a poem that can't be republished. Do you have any guidelines in terms of like narrowing out, like maybe don't try to this journal?
Well, most of them will. It's true. Most journals will only take first published work. That's true. However, usually the rights revert to you. So that means that you can put it on your website or you can put it in your book. And there are some journals that will take previously published work. So I always feel that getting published is better than not getting published. So I would not hold back,
Well, fair enough.
from getting published. As far as journals that I don't submit to, I don't submit to journals if I don't match the demographic. For example, those of you who have seen my stories know that, I'm not really, I kind of cross genres in my stories, but my prose is relatively traditional. It's not experimental. So I don't bother submitting to an experimental journal because they're not gonna want my work. I don't submit to journals that just want formal verse because I don't write formal verse. I only write blank verse. But other than that, sometimes I will try a contest. Sometimes I will try some of the journals that only accept 0. Because usually, for me anyway, I don't know how it is for other people. Every time I write something new, I think it's the best thing I ever wrote. And so I think, how can anybody possibly reject this? So I'll send it out to a few of the best journals to start with, and then I'll start working my way kind of down the ladder a little bit. But I think that's healthy too.
All right, let's all go gather around Terry and say goodbye to our audience. Special shout out to Fred, who's been commenting and following us and all our crazy jumps. We know you're out
Doing
there.
our best.
And we're really happy to know that you're out there. Thank you so much, Terry. This was really informative.
I really loved it.
Yeah, and something we all need. We all need to keep submitting, always be submitting. Thank you for Christina
Yes,
for moderating the
definitely.
panel, and
Thank you.
Karma
You're
for
very
all our
welcome.
tech support. So this is, we are just the tip of the iceberg of the California Writers Club. And we'll figure out our next steps as they come. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks.
Don't
Thank
forget
you.
physical distancing.